So, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Gravitee Edge 2023. For this session, we have Bob Thomas from Oxx and Jonathan Drillings from Riverside, some of our investors who will be joining us for a really, really interesting session today. So to start off, I'm going to ask a question and hopefully pass it over to you guys to give a quick introduction and then carry on with the rest of it. So what is generally attractive or interesting about the API management market? Over to you.
Perfect. Who should go first, Jonathan? Me or you on intros?
Why don't you go first on intros, and then I'll follow up and then roll into the answer.
Fine. Georgie, thank you for having us both on. It's a pleasure to speak about API management and investing in the space. My name is Bob Thomas. I'm a partner with Oxx. As you can tell from the kind of general level of darkness around me, I'm based in Stockholm in Sweden, and I work with a team here to invest in B2B software businesses around Europe. We are very happy and proud to have invested in Gravitee several years ago, and continue to be super excited by what we see both in the open source space, in the data infrastructure space more generally, and specifically in API management. Jonathan, over to you.
Thanks, Bob. And thanks, Georgie, as well. And thanks to Gravitee and the team for having us. Also proud to say that we're investors and we get to work with this wonderful team. We're a hybrid growth capital fund. So I'm a partner at a group called Riverside Capital. It's a hybrid growth capital fund focused on B2B software companies. I'm based in the New York area, and we invest all across the US as well as obviously in the UK and Europe and a few other places around the world, all kind of focused around earlier growing companies up through scale-up phase. And we really enjoyed working with the team over the past year and a half now, which has been great. So to try to tackle your kickoff question, Georgie, what's interesting about the API management, at least in our point of view, we'll start very high level, really try to keep it fairly simple. The world is digitizing. Software continues to proliferate, and it does so in an ever complex and ever innovative way. And ultimately, APIs are part of that glue layer that hold it all together. They're part of that interstitial layer, the middleware space that helps it all interoperate well. And so as long as you believe that the world is going to continue to digitize, which we certainly do, and software will continue to proliferate, and probably that there will be new and innovative ways that it proliferates, then APIs should continue to grow as part of that interconnective layer and that glue. And platforms that help you to build and manage and design those APIs should have really good opportunity going forward. And so that's kind of high level. I think, those platforms that are doing that in a way that help you kind of manage really innovative stuff, I think have probably the outsized opportunity. But broadly, the market's growing really quickly. And, just to dive a level deeper and get into some of the numbers, this is all from our friends at Gartner, but they don't really see the broad technology space slowing down. So, the global IT spending in the enterprise is already about $5 trillion a year. And it slowed a little bit in 2022 with the challenges in the macro environment. But their view is that organizations are going to have to put the spend in and put the work in, and it's going to continue to grow quite quickly, and actually up to about 8% per year over the next few years. And software is a big piece of that. And software, which is almost $1 trillion already, is going to grow 14%. This year, and then keep actually growing quite quickly over the next few years. And so those platforms are continuing to proliferate. Cloud spending is over $1 trillion already, and is going to be growing 20% over the next few years as well. And so those are, not the fastest growth rates, especially for those maybe of us in the technology ecosystem that are used to, 50, 100 faster growth rates. But if you think about the scale of that, there is an enormous amount of spend that's being added each year. 8% of 5 trillion is like 400 million or $400 billion a year, right? And talking about cloud and software, you're talking about 150, $200 billion a year that are being added to these markets. And a lot of it is in the kind of more innovative direction. It's in the more complex direction. So just for example, cloud ecosystems are getting more complex. So Gartner talked about how by 2027, 80% of large and mid-sized enterprises are going to be invested in multi-cloud and hybrid cloud architectures, which is up from 55% last year. And so those sorts of ecosystems are proliferating, which adds complexity. And then you have these new use cases that are coming in. So I'm sure we've all heard about experienced generative AI. And that is, very light on use cases in the enterprise today, right? Enterprises are still figuring it out. And Gartner thinks it's going to go from 5% of organizations that have generative AI deployed to 80% in just a few years in 2026. And so that's a rapidly evolving thing. And so not only do you have an enormous amount of growth in the ecosystem, but it's driven a lot by these complex and innovative elements. And so, you not only have a fast growing API management market, which I think today they've got labeled around $3 billion, growing to actually double, almost $7 billion by 2027. But, we think that a lot of the growth in that market is going to be driven by platforms that help you solve those more innovative and complex use cases. So that's just kind of the general market drivers. I think the other interesting thing about this market that we've found is that products tend to be fairly sticky, right? APIs, if you think about it, almost from a physical perspective, it would be like the plumbing in a building, right? And you don't go out changing that plumbing all the time. You tend not to do it very frequently at all, unless you absolutely have to. And so, the platforms tend to be very sticky. But for the growth segment, that can be a little bit of a double-edged sword, because not only do you get in and stick, but that goes for the incumbents as well. And so, again, we think that the opportunity is in this more complex and innovative space as the overall market grows. But you have to be prepared to take advantage of that, because you're not going to eat away at the incumbents that are already in place. So anyway, that's kind of our high level thoughts. I've talked a lot about the changes in the market, but I know, Bob, you guys have thought extensively about that. So why don't I pass it over to you for some of your high level thoughts in the market and where it's going?
Sure, absolutely. I think, very aligned with you in terms of seeing fundamentally software adoption and growing complexity as the driver. I think what's really interesting is, you've mentioned generative AI. From an investor's perspective, investing in, for example, Gen AI today is a totally different concept to investing in Gen AI 2 years ago. And so I think what we see in API management and API adoption and complexity generally is a similar kind of step change in terms of complexity at several phases along the way. It's a fundamentally different proposition investing in AI management businesses today versus call it 10 years ago. I think we had this first generation of API management businesses, the likes of Apogee or Mashery in Tibco now, that kind of provided the first generation of gateways. You could set up simple reverse proxies, insert control API traffic, throttle things. Maybe you had simple developer portals starting to spring up where you had SDKs that allowed people to develop using your APIs, maybe kind of basic monitoring, basic analytics, but fundamentally a different order of complexity to what's required today. We kind of see the evolution of that phase into a second phase where you have the likes of Kong or Red Hat starting to offer business tools to enable people to deal with microservices differently, maybe looking at kind of hybrid cloud, multi-cloud deployments, starting to think about more advanced security use cases as you have APIs that start to deal with kind of payments in large volumes, things like that. And I think that's the kind of second wave, which is interesting. But I think what's becoming really clear now, you mentioned some of the more complex use cases. I'm sure we'll come on some specific ones in a minute. AI and kind of data proliferation around AI is just one of them. But we're now very much into this third wave, so kind of out of the second wave into the third wave, where more complex use cases. I think because of how APIs are the plumbing in the building, as you mentioned, and that plumbing not only doesn't get changed very often, but needs to be secure. When you have a leak in the plumbing, it can be pretty structural to the whole building. And so I think this Gen 3 set of API management businesses is really thinking about the whole API lifecycle, from design, testing, development, versioning, eventually retirement. How do I safely retire bits of the plumbing of my building without kind of springing a leak and the building's falling apart? This is a kind of a more complex thing, and the developer experience around managing that complexity has just fundamentally changed. So that's I think what made the investment case super exciting from our perspective, is we could see we were just entering this Gen 3 of an industry, and there was going to be a paradigm shift in how people were thinking about APIs. I don't know, how does that kind of strike you? Does that kind of match how you guys thought about it?
Yeah, it does. It absolutely does. I mean, you need follow-on waves to address the the growing innovation and complexity of the market, right? It's exactly aligned with us, and I think we will often also think about the overall dynamics of what's going on in a market and with a workforce, to try to think through, how organizations are going to best leverage the tools that are out there. And one of the things that we think a lot about at Riverside broadly, actually, is workforce productivity. And, not necessarily in a way of like, let's actually streamline the workforce and, find ways to replace people. It's actually more about how do we give people superpowers in a way, because I'm sure everyone listening to this feels the same way about having too many things on their plate and not enough ways to do it. An increasingly complex world, right? We live in this entropic universe that is constantly getting more complex and more challenging. And everyone is dealing with this labor and workforce challenge right now, where people are hard to hire, they're hard to retain, they're expensive to do both. And so any ways that you can improve your workforce today and make them better and faster is really interesting to us. And we've got investments in this in a bunch of different segments. I mean, we've got one in the healthcare based living communities, so like a senior living, skilled nursing, things like that help these very slim teams to better manage themselves and better go out and sell, so they can bring in new folks into the community. We have ones in the marketing space, for example, that help with reviews and approvals and stuff like that, and a bunch more. Riverside itself has a lot in training and things like that. Anyway, that's a very long-winded way of saying that we think that platforms that kind of give teams those superpowers are super interesting, and also when you can push capabilities out across the organization in an ever complex world. So I'm sure everyone's experienced, bottlenecks in trying to get projects done and things like that. And, one of the things that we think is really interesting about Gravitee in particular, but, broadly along this train of thought, is if you can give people the capabilities to execute their job, but do it in a faster and more efficient way, then you're going to be probably in a pretty good place. And even more so, if you can basically port the ability to do those things to the users that want to do them. So a business unit that wants to open an API, rather than having to wait for the technical team to actually do that, if they can do that themselves, that puts them in a winning position. They can do it faster. They can not have to wait for something to get done. And it takes a lot of burden off the technical team to get done the things that they really want to get done, that are going to best advance the business, rather than the kind of, more blocking and tackling type things. So we think that's a really interesting opportunity in this market, as we do broadly.
Interesting. And thinking about that complexity, I mean, we see kind of growing technical complexity in terms of microservices, organizational complexity in terms of numbers of teams and tasks they might be fulfilling. and also kind of increased complexity just because of the velocity of the data that people are handling. I guess one of the interesting things is thinking about a world where people are enabled to build products that address kind of real-time data use cases because of that growth in complexity. I know that that's something you've spent a bit of time thinking about in terms of kind of real-time product.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for bringing that up. You talked about the different waves of API management. We're in this kind of 3.0 world right now, and I think a big part of that is managing the different types of data flows, right? REST APIs, they're kind of classic. We all think about them, but they require that push and pull. But there are tons of use cases where it makes more sense to just continually stream information or to have it be more event-based, right? I mean, I can't imagine, a trading desk that wants to, continually do, push and pull information as opposed to getting live updates, just for example. And it happens across a wide range of ecosystems. The hospital wouldn't function well if, critical alerts were not pushed out in the right way. And so there is this growing dynamic around event management, and the event management space itself is a fairly established market and is growing. But from what we've seen, and I think the keynote actually here at Gravitee Edge from Forrester just made note of this as well, that within their established EDA product, group, which stands for event-driven architecture, CDA. So they have this established group, but a third, which is actually seems like they're leading inquiry, in fact, is around leveraging, I think, that next step. So going from just event management within your organization and within systems themselves to event portals and applying API management to events. And so it's quite clear that folks within the event space are thinking about it, but it also seems to be proliferating across organizations as well. So Solace, which is one of the event management platforms in the space, I think they put out some research that something like 85% of organizations within this survey that they had run. And I'm going to go ahead and guess that it's probably a little bit more biased towards organizations that had some sort of engagement with EDA, but 85 had leveraged event-driven architecture, EDA, in some way, but 72% had it kind of used across the organization, but actually only 13% had in-house EDA design skills and felt like they were kind of at this gold standard of having used it broadly. And so it's still something that's growing. The ability to kind of leverage it within an API framework and start sharing that data across systems is still early. And I think also importantly, the universal management of different types of APIs is still early as well. They're still in many ways kind of managed by separate types of systems and maybe even teams. And so when you get into that gets into a lot of complexity, right? And we talked just a couple minutes ago about trying to reduce complexity within workforce and within a labor environment. But when you have multiple different systems you have to work with, that just adds complexity. And I was actually asking the Gravitee team in preparation for this chat, and they said that only about 20% of organizations that they work with have applied a consistent approach to managing sync, async, and event-based APIs. And so it seems like there's a lot of opportunity there too, and really kind of reducing complexity and making it easier and better, faster, and more efficient for organizations. So I don't know if you have any additional thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it kind of speaks to this kind of Gen 3 evolution point again, because I mean, to go back to your analogy around plumbing, yes, you don't rip the plumbing out in the building very often, but the complexity of, plumbing REST or graph versus event streaming is massively different and requires fundamentally different technology and a different approach within teams. So there's still a huge amount of evolution of that space to come, but I think the businesses that leverage it early therefore should have a competitive advantage, which I think is exciting.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. So we've probably talked enough about API management directly at this point, but maybe we transition into some other areas. I know you guys have done a lot of work in the open source space broadly. Gravitee was born out of the open source world. They still have an open source version of their software. They're still part of that ecosystem. I'm sure there's a million other interesting platforms out there. We're not going to cover them all, but any out there that you see in kind of adjacent spaces or with related dynamics that you think it's worth talking about?
Yeah, and we, as you say, we do spend a lot of time thinking about open source. We produce a little bit of analysis each year where we try to analyze early stage projects, that are becoming commercial businesses, and have, a large degree of developer traction, a large degree of kind of early customer adoption, maybe even before they're at the phase where a lot of investors would notice their financial metrics. We in 2021 that was kind of one of the things that we had highlighted about Gravitee. But moving beyond API management for a second, I think one of the things that we're seeing this year in 2023 is firstly, as you said, kind of the explosion of Gen AI. I mean, the growth of just the LangChain project, which is essentially kind of vectorizing and kind of applying agents to data. That project became, twice as engaged with as OpenAI's core open source project within a couple of months. So Harrison Chase, who set that up, went from kind of, I mean, I won't say zero. He was a kind of established entrepreneur and developer anyway, but went from kind of not very big to hero in a matter of days, which is really interesting. We're seeing some really interesting businesses grow up. Businesses like FlowWise that are starting to create agent technologies to allow you to string sets of generative actions together, and I think we'll see some of the cloud majors come out with similar products. But I think fundamentally the thing that we're seeing that doesn't really change year on year in open source is this massive focus on performance. I think people are looking at the existing set of incumbent tools. I mean, we mentioned kind of Apogee to Kong to Gen 3 in API management, but for example, looking at kind of databases, Redis, a super established SaaS database solution, which I think a lot of businesses around the world would still see as quite leading edge. We highlighted in our report this year Dragonfly DB, which is an Israeli business that is taking that next step, essentially saying, okay, you like Redis, you had some use cases for Redis. What happens if you can just switch that out for Dragonfly and have the same thing, but much faster, much more performant? And I think when businesses are firstly scaling, but starting to encounter this new, this kind of new event-driven world where data streaming requires massive amounts of data to be captured and analyzed very quickly, performance really matters. Actually, we get into a world where very quickly, like microseconds of performance loss can hugely impact your business's performance. And you mentioned a trading desk earlier, streaming event data. If you're a hedge fund or a bank and you receive, firstly, trading information that you can't analyze quickly, but also if your database is at a certain point reaching a performance bottleneck and just shuts down completely, like that can be kind of catastrophic for your business. So we're seeing a focus on people building highly performant technology in the open. And yeah, I mean, year in, year out, that is the thing that I find most exciting about open source.
Super interesting. Well, great. I think that probably takes us through most of our time here. Yeah, Georgie, I don't know if you had any last bits you wanted to talk about, but maybe we'll pass it back over to you.
Perfect. Thank you both very much. I actually do have a question for you. So we're seeing, despite the economy at the moment, we are seeing so many startups, I suppose like pre-Series A, who are looking for investments, etc. Now, how do you, as investors, how do you differentiate in the companies who you say, yes, they have an amazing idea. They have, they're doing everything they need to do. We need to absolutely invest in this company. We need to make sure, of course, that we're giving that workforce, as you mentioned earlier, the magic power or the tools that they need in order to push this company to go really, really far and do amazing things. I suppose what would be your number one thing that you would advise to a company like that? And what would potentially be your red flag of absolutely no, we can't go there kind of thing?
Yeah. You want to take it, Bob? You want me to take it?
Let's both take a shot at it. I'm happy to go first. I think fundamentally building a company and scaling a company is a, despite all the technology that's involved, still a people-centric enterprise. I think it's a people-centric enterprise that takes several years. The road to success is never a clear and straight one. And so I think it's about understanding that you have a team in place that knows where they're going, has a really clear vision, but ultimately has the resilience to survive some of the bumps in the road and kind of keep on going.
Yeah, I'll agree with that for sure. We tend to start working with companies that have at least a few million in revenue at the time that we get engaged, and sometimes more. And that means they've got an established product in market. But when you start to think about how you scale that business, and Bob and Oxx work in a similar phase. When you start to think about how you're going to grow and scale that business, that's where the people come in. And I think one of the really interesting things about generative AI is, it does help with things like coding and development. And, ultimately we're going to get to this point where products can be much more easily built. They're already much cheaper than they were years and years ago to build and deploy. But then you get to this point where you actually, you've kind of sold to those early adopters and you need to figure out how to scale. And that can be quite tricky. And so when we take a step back from that and we think about what companies might be well positioned, it comes right in line with some of the things that we talked about earlier. What are the trends in the market? Is that company well positioned for it? Is this a growing market? Is it a growing market that this company is going to be able to take advantage of? Has it factor into overall, market dynamics? And really think a lot about that, because right now I think a lot of companies are facing some headwinds. It's hard out there. Sales cycles are longer. Customers are managing their budget more tightly. We saw even in the Gartner numbers, right? There was a dip this past year. It didn't drop to negative growth, but growth dropped a little bit before it's expected that the wind will hit its sails again, because organizations do need to invest into technology. But it's been a little bit of a slower market for many businesses, and so we need to think about the fundamentals and whether those are in place and going to be strong when those market tailwinds come back, as opposed to the headwinds.
Yeah, of course. And I definitely think resilience is a key word that you mentioned there as well. Thank you both very much for this session. It's been extremely insightful. I'll let you get on with your days now. And if anybody does have any questions, don't forget that there is a chat function just over to the side where you are able to ask any questions that you possibly like. Thank you both. Take care.
Thank you for having us.